This video is sponsored by MyHeritage. It all started 3 months ago.
Breaking news here in Germany.
Germany's three-party coalition has collapsed.
Chancellor Scholz has called a confidence vote.
One that he is widely expected to lose, and if he does, voters will be going to the polls in a general election on February the 23rd.
What is next?
After 3 years of the traffic light coalition, actually funny name, right? Isn't it?
Germany's next Chancellor. 4 candidates.
We are convinced that we will win.
Friedrich Merz.
One big issue is migration.
We see that this country is in need of real reforms.
Alice Weidel.
I'm seeing myself as a German politician for Europe.
Robert Habeck.
Europa ist das wichtigste nationale Interesse, das wir haben.
And Olaf Scholz. And now, the key question. What does the German election mean for Europe? Ultimately, this all depends on which candidate will win the election, because each of them has a very different vision. And that's exactly what we'll look into in today's video. Polls put the CDU-CSU's Merz in the lead, with the AfD in second place, while the SPD and Greens struggle to catch up. But if the AfD surges further, Germany and Europe could be heading for a transformation unlike anything seen before. In this video, we break down what each of these 4 candidates envisions for Germany's foreign policy, its role in Europe, and the world. To do this, we've gone through their manifestos and public appearances to see what they're actually proposing. We will focus on 3 areas, starting with the future of the European Union. The main Chancellor candidates are all pro-EU, with one major exception, Alice Weidel from the AfD, who has a very different vision.
We don't see that the European Union in its current state is an institution that is working well, right? So what we need to have is free trade among the European countries, but we don't need all the bureaucracy.
Let's cut to the chase. Weidel's AfD wants to dismantle the European Union as we know it and replace it with what she calls a Europe of nations, a loose alliance of sovereign states focused purely on economic cooperation and shared interests. This means strict EU borders? Check. Preserving European cultures? Check. Political integration? Absolutely not. Basically, less Europe, more Germany. And then there's the euro. The AfD manifesto doesn't just criticize the common currency. They call for Germany to exit the eurozone entirely. Yes, this means the return of the German Deutsche Mark, alongside a financial system where Germany regains full control over its fiscal and monetary policies. Their argument? The ECB's interventions, EU debt policies, and endless bailouts violate agreements and put an unfair burden on German taxpayers. Now, while their manifesto doesn't explicitly call for a Dexit, as they did in their EU election program last year, this is, for all intents and purposes, exactly what it means. The AfD is, of course, best known for its hardline stance on migration, and one of their solutions is simple. Shut the German borders.
Wir werden weiter für eine wirkliche Migrationswende mit Schließung der Grenzen, Zurückweisung und Abschiebung von illegalen Ausländern eintreten.
But Weidel and the AfD aren't alone on this. Merz and the CDU are also pushing for border controls, though in this case, it's only for as long as he deems it a national emergency. This puts both the AfD and CDU on a direct collision course with the EU, where the Schengen area guarantees open borders between member states. Scholz, the incumbent and Merz's direct opponent, didn't hold back.
Genau das aber tun Sie, Herr Merz, wenn Sie sagen, wir wenden europäisches Recht an unseren Grenzen einfach nicht mehr an. Das ist die Antwort der Populisten. Das größte Land der EU würde offen EU-Recht brechen, so wie das bislang nur Viktor Orban in Ungarn wagt.
So, while the AfD and CDU-CSU support national borders, which challenge Schengen, the SPD and Greens strongly oppose closing them and instead call for an EU-wide response. Their concern? If Germany reinstates border checks, other countries might do the same, setting off a domino effect that could ultimately collapse Schengen. However, Merz is firmly pro-EU and wants Germany to take more responsibility and work closely with its neighbors, especially on major issues like security.
Doch wir haben nach meinem festen Gefühl alle Chancen, in dieser Zeit des Epochenbruchs nicht nur zu bestehen, sondern als europäische Gemeinschaft noch viel enger zusammenzurücken. Denn wir sind in dieser Europäischen Union. Am dringlichsten ist dabei die Reparatur unserer Beziehungen zu unseren beiden wichtigsten Nachbarn in Europa, zu Polen und zu Frankreich. Eine von mir geführte Bundesregierung wird die Sprachlosigkeit zwischen Berlin und Warschau von Tag 1 an beenden.
Great news for Germany's neighbors, especially for Macron, who hasn't exactly had the smoothest relationship with Scholz. But here's the thing, the Greens and the SPD manifesto also highlight the importance of the Poland and France partnerships. But for Habeck and especially Scholz, this really feels a little too late. Let's not forget how often Scholz went solo on Russia and China, making massive moves without consulting Germany's EU partners. Nevertheless, Merz, Habeck and Scholz all envision a stronger Europe.
Gerade in dieser Zeit, wo Russland unsere Friedensordnung bedroht, wo Präsident Trump einen neuen politischen Kurs einschlägt, gerade in dieser Zeit ist die Einigkeit Europas wichtiger denn je.
Wir brauchen aber nicht Germany first oder Italy first oder France first, sondern wir brauchen ein klares Verständnis, dass Europa in dieser herausfordernden Zeit zusammenstehen muss.
Now, before we dive into the details of what a stronger Europe means exactly, have you ever wondered about your family's past? That's where today's sponsor, MyHeritage, comes into play. A true game changer in discovering your roots. When I first tried it, all I did was enter basic information about my parents and grandparents. And boom! My family tree started unfolding before my eyes. I uncovered my great-grandparents and traced generations I never knew existed. All easily done with MyHeritage's intuitive platform and its 20 billion historical records. What's more, I uncovered some fascinating family connections. For instance, I found ancestors with roots in Turkey and Indonesia. Turns out the Dutch colonial history in Indonesia wasn't just something I learned in school, it's part of my very own story. And here's the best part. I added my first cousin twice removed to my family tree, and he actually reached out to me. And now we're collaborating on our own combined family tree. MyHeritage also has incredible features to bring your family history to life. I found this old family photo of my great uncle, and their tools let me repair, colorize, enhance, and even animate it. It's like stepping back in time. And here's the exciting part. You can try it all out with a 14-day free trial. So dive into your family's past and uncover stories you never knew existed. So check the link in the description to get started today. Now back to the video. With the exception of the AfD, all three major parties want to deepen the single market and strengthen Europe's competitiveness. Merz pushes for an energy union, where the EU countries coordinate energy policies to secure supply and lower costs, and a capital markets union, where investment and finance flow more freely across Europe. The SPD support the capital markets union, and so do the Greens, but only with strict regulations, social and ecological safeguards, and protection for regional banks. When it comes to a European energy union, things get a little more vague. Neither the SPD nor the Greens make a direct reference to it in their manifestos. But given their strong stance on clean energy, it's safe to assume they'd only support it if it meant renewables, not fossil fuels nor nuclear energy. Merz also envisions a more efficient Europe by cutting unnecessary bureaucracy and legislation. Sound familiar? That's because the AfD, Greens and SPD all claim to want to do the same, but the CDU and AfD definitely want to take it further. For example, the CDU wants a one-in, two-out rule for regulations to slash red tape. Then, both the CDU and AfD want to scrap the EU's supply chain ruling, arguing it burdens businesses. And when it comes to the Green Deal or the Migration Pact, the AfD isn't just critical, they outright reject it. Interestingly, Merz's CDU, Scholz's SPD and Habeck's Greens all call for EU reform. Though, to be fair, so does the AfD, just in the opposite direction, with reforms aimed at dismantling the EU altogether. Merz, though, wants to reform how the EU makes decisions, but still keep most of power with individual countries, unless there's a clear benefit to acting at EU level. Sounds reasonable, but where exactly would the EU gain power, and where would it lose it? His manifesto doesn't say. A bit vague, to be honest. The SPD and the Greens, on the other hand, are much clearer. They want big changes to EU treaties, including scrapping the veto vote on foreign policy and giving the EU Parliament the power to create laws, a huge shift on how the EU works. That said, when it comes to the SPD, we haven't found any recent clip of Scholz actually talking about this himself. So we have to wonder, is the political will really there? And the Greens? Well, they talk about it and go even further.
I'm seeing myself as a German politician for Europe. So I deeply believe that Germany's role is to bring Europe together, let Europe speak with one voice, let our problems and ideas be solved via Europe.
In a nutshell, according to their manifesto, the Greens' ultimate goal is a federal European republic with a common constitution, basically transforming the EU into a fully fledged political entity for key areas like foreign policy.
Germany's role is to help Europe to unite, and that means a special form of helping. Nobody wants us to be the master of Europe and say basta and say we know everything better, you have just to listen. Our role is always to be on the side of creating a majority, to help, making the next step possible.
So, when it comes to EU reform and integration, the Greens advocate the most ambitious changes, followed by the SPD. In contrast, the CDU's manifesto lacks substantial proposals in this area. And then there's EU expansion. The Western Balkans, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, and Turkey are all waiting in line. No surprises here. The AfD is strongly against enlargement. But the Greens, SPD, and CDU all support the accession of the Western Balkans, Moldova, and Ukraine, as long as they meet the criteria. Only the Greens explicitly mention Georgia, which is a bit disappointing, given the massive pro-European demonstrations happening there at the moment. Both the Greens and CDU also want stronger relationships with Turkey. But when it comes to EU membership, Merz has an interesting idea for moving things forward.
Ich finde, und ich habe darüber auch mit Macron gesprochen, wir müssen uns etwas einfallen lassen, dass wir diese scharfe Unterscheidung zwischen ganz draußen oder ganz drin überwinden und etwas schaffen, was sozusagen den Weg hin zur Vollmitgliedschaft eröffnet, Möglichkeiten verschafft, teilzunehmen, etwa an Teilen des europäischen Binnenmarkts. Ich sage mal so ein Beispiel wie die Schweiz jetzt mit Schengen, aber das sollte auch für andere Länder gelten. Ich sage mal nicht nur die Westbalkanstaaten, Großbritannien. Ich habe den Eindruck, auch aus meinen Gesprächen mit Keir Starmer, dass die Briten sehr daran interessiert sind, wieder Schritt für Schritt mit der Europäischen Union zusammenzuarbeiten. Und ich nenne mal ein Land, das vielleicht in den strategischen Fokus mindestens genauso gehört wie die genannten, das ist die Türkei. Auch für die Türkei, die Mitgliedschaft der Türkei in der Europäischen Union stellt sich aus meiner Sicht für längere Zeit nicht. Aber auch da die scharfe Unterscheidung zwischen ganz draußen und ganz drin blockiert uns in allen Möglichkeiten, mit diesem Land eine stärkere Kooperation einzugehen.
This sounds a lot like the multi-tier Europe that Macron floated a few years ago. A system where countries that aren't full EU members can gradually integrate through different levels of cooperation. We actually made a whole video about this before, link above if you're interested. So, this is what each of the candidates wants for the future of Europe. Now let's dive into the next big topic, European security and defense, the big one.
All the Europeans understood that it's necessary that we develop our defense industry. We need better scales, we need a reduced number of successful weapon systems, and this is the basis for all what we are looking for.
In my opinion, that the Europeans should put their act together, doing more within the NATO. Germany, for instance, never have been paying 2% of GDP at all. But it's also in our responsibility to formulate our national interests, because our national interest is quite different from the US.
Europa muss nach außen gucken. Europa muss sehen, dass es weltpolitikfähig wird, handlungsfähig wird in der Sicherheitspolitik, in der inneren Sicherheitspolitik, in der Verteidigungspolitik, in der Außenpolitik, mit einer Stimme spricht, einfachere Verhältnisse hat, das Mehrheitswahlrecht, das Mehrheitsverhältniswahlrecht einführt, sich im Inneren reformiert, damit Europa als politische Wertegemeinschaft auf der Weltbühne repräsentiert wird.
In short, the CDU, Greens and SPD all want more European defense cooperation, pushing for a European defense union with joint weapons production, shared common procurement, common R&D, and better access to defense funding. The AfD? Not a chance. Their manifesto doesn't mention any of this, which given their stance on the EU, isn't exactly surprising. Where all four parties do agree, however, is that military spending needs to go up, above 2% of GDP. The Greens take it further though, with Habeck floating 3.5% in January. The AfD doesn't set a target in their manifesto, but Weidel has shown support for Trump's demand that NATO members spend 5% of GDP, and even suggested Germany might need to go beyond that point. The big question though, how do they pay for it? Here's where things get tricky. The SPD have a clear answer: borrow money, for example, through a European defense bond. The CDU and AfD? Absolutely not.
Und bevor wir uns nicht der Vereinfachung, der Standardisierung und der Skalierung widmen, halte ich neue, mitgliedschaftlich finanzierte Fonds oder gar gemeinschaftliche Schulden für nicht zielführend.
The CDU pledges significant tax cuts while boosting military spending, all without incurring new national or EU debt. But how do they plan to fund it? Their answer is economic growth, spending cuts, and bureaucratic streamlining. Analysts, however, remain skeptical. Will these measures truly be enough to finance their ambitious defense plans? There are bigger strategic questions that divide the parties too. The CDU explicitly states in its manifesto that the EU needs to consider a shared nuclear deterrent, a big shift in European defense policy. Meanwhile, the SPD and Greens focus on something else. Their manifesto calls for the gradual integration of national units into multinational structures. What does that mean though? Well, it suggests a deeper merging of European armed forces, where national units work together, operate under joint command, and contribute to collective EU and NATO defense efforts. A European army, you ask? Well, their manifestos are pretty vague on that one. And then the final and third topic, Ukraine, where Scholz has made his position loud and clear.
Deutschland ist Ihr größter Unterstützer in Europa. Das muss so bleiben. Und das wird so bleiben, solange die Ukraine unsere Unterstützung braucht. Dafür stehe ich und dafür steht die Deutsche Sozialdemokratische Partei.
Quick fact check. No, Scholz. Germany is not the biggest supporter in the EU. At least not if you look at support as percentage of GDP. And since Germany is Europe's largest country by far, that's really what you should look at. So, kudos to Estonia and Denmark. Still, when it comes to military, humanitarian, diplomatic, and financial aid, plus sanctions for Russia, the Greens, CDU, and SPD all agree. Support for Ukraine must continue. The AfD, though, not so much. They want to stop all support for Ukraine and lift sanctions on Russia. On top of that, they push for reactivating Russian gas supplies through the Nord Stream pipeline, a move that would completely reverse Germany's current energy strategy. As for Scholz, well, he positions himself as the peace chancellor. His approach? Support Ukraine, but cautiously, avoiding escalation. That means no Taurus missiles and recently blocking 3 billion euros in aid. His critics argue that Scholz has actually hurt Ukraine, since German support has often come too late, just before Ukraine was on the brink of collapse. Remember the embarrassing helmet deliveries? Or the months of debate over sending tanks? This definitely hasn't helped Ukraine. As Scholz's main opponent, Merz obviously agrees, and has been one of Scholz's strongest critics on Ukraine. And while Scholz says Ukraine cannot lose, Merz takes it a step further, saying Ukraine must win.
Und für die Ukraine lautet nach meiner Einschätzung die wichtigste Antwort: Sie muss den Krieg gewinnen. Gewinnen heißt für mich die Wiederherstellung der territorialen Integrität mit einer in Ausübung eigener staatlicher Souveränität demokratisch legitimierten Regierung. Gewinnen heißt auch, dass die Ukraine die vollständige Freiheit zur Wahl ihrer politischen und gegebenenfalls auch militärischen Bündnisse haben muss.
This implies that Merz's CDU would support Ukraine joining NATO, even though their manifesto stays quiet on the issue. The Greens, however, don't hesitate. They explicitly call for Ukraine's NATO accession in their manifesto. And the SPD? Silent. The AfD? Completely against it. But when it comes to a clear peace plan, a concrete proposal for how this war should actually end, all parties are lacking. As for the AfD, they've constantly called for peace, but their solution is to cut off all support to Ukraine. Critics argue this would only weaken Ukraine's negotiating position and hand Russia exactly what it wants, and potentially encourage even more aggression in the future. So, here's the final overview of where the parties stand in Europe. First, the future of the EU. Then, European security and defense. And finally, support for Ukraine. After listening to hours of speeches and debates and digging through hundreds of pages of manifestos, we think we've got a pretty solid picture of where each candidate places their emphasis on foreign policy. Merz wants Germany to step up, to take on more responsibility in Europe and the world. His vision, a reliable, dependable Germany working closely with partners to tackle the continent's most pressing challenges. Scholz is all about the status quo. His manifesto has a bit of everything, but when it comes down to it, he keeps repeating the same message: peace and caution, no escalation, steady leadership, and no surprises. Habeck puts European cooperation and integration front and center. His approach: we need to do more together to succeed in defense, climate change, or immigration. And unlike the others, the Greens' manifesto is the only one to explicitly mention a European federation. And then there's Weidel. Her approach is Germany first and Europe second. Less integration, less cooperation with European neighbors, and a radical shift away from the EU as it exists today. Let us know what you think, and if you are German, let us know in the comments who your favorite candidate is and why. Also, if you like this format, we can do another one about migration or economy. So, let us know what you'd like to see. And don't miss the chance to explore your family roots. Sign up for a 14-day free trial of My Heritage today. And if you'd like to support us further, consider joining us on Patreon. Every contribution helps us bring you more in-depth discussions on Europe's future. Thank you to our presidents, Jan, Schaukje, Kristin, Peter, AGVD, and BJ. See you in the next video.